Hey, everybody, welcome to Teaching for Transfer. We're going to just jump right into it and talk a little bit about what's the difference between transfer and surface and deep. So one way that I'd like us to think about this is I want us to think about depth. So learning more about a certain subject area, about a certain content matter, and then breadth, that idea of being able to see across multiple contexts or multiple situations. Transfer is all about breadth. It's all about taking all of that great knowledge that we have and saying, hey, now can I apply that into multiple situations? So imagine I'm looking at understanding what a food chain is. That would be surface. Understanding what a food web is. That would be surface. Deep would be understanding how those two things relate, to understand how energy dissipates within an ecosystem. This would be surface to deep learning, or I might say the different parts of the body system. Deep would be relating those particular parts of the body system together to understand homeostasis. And then transfer is being able to apply that. So what happens if the body is under pressure and we go deep in outer space, or we go deep underwater, or we get malaria, or we have COVID? All of that would be transfer. So transfer is all about breadth. How do we help students actually take that great knowledge that they're developing in class, and how do we apply that into multiple situations? So we're going to look at that. There are two specific behaviors that we look at here. That's habit 9 and habit 10. Habit 9, how do we build contextual understanding? Context meaning different situations. How do students see across different situations? And number 2, how do we actually help students solve complex problems? So if we give them a problem of an invasive species in an ecosystem, or if a patient gets malaria, what do we do to actually help students actually go through and solve those problems? Again, one thing you can do is go in here and you can take that kind of green, yellow, red dots, or you can do the survey or just kind of color it in. Green, we routinely do this with students. Yellow, we do it sometimes. Red, either you might be doing it, but students are not, or you might be displaying it or learning about it, but it's not necessarily a part of your consistent practice with students. Again, it's not good or bad. It's just where you are at this particular point in time with students. And so let's jump into some small tangible practices. So I'm going to show you a couple of practices that you can do to just help students build transfer learning. Remember that transfer doesn't have to be a project. It's not an event. It's not at the end of the school year, or, okay, we've got one day before our winter break, let's do transfer. It's really about what are those small doable habits that you can do with students every day to just help them kind of think outside and start to move those kind of blinders when they're just doing our subject area to be able to see across multiple situations. One of those is analogies and metaphors. Really simple practice, doesn't take a ton of time. Step 1, ask students to read several analogies related to a concept. So imagine you're comparing longitudinal and transverse waves, something you might do in 7th or 8th grade physics, excuse me. And what you might do, and you could just do this on like a chat bot. You could go to ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or any of these, and you could just say, hey, create 8 analogies for me that would relate transverse and longitudinal waves. And then what you would do, so you can see here that the one in the little four square that we have is the plot of a story is like a roller coaster ride. And so you might say, does that, which one of those does that maybe necessarily connect with? This is one way that you can do it, by generating some analogies, have students compare those analogies or metaphors and say, how's that similar and different to the relationship we're looking at with the particular subject that we're studying? So you might say, if I look at like food chains and a food web, well, a food chain to me kind of reminds me of like a road. So you might say food chains are like a road. But a food web might be like a map of like complicated roads and transit systems, because there's so much more complexity. And ask the students, how similar is that in terms of those types of analogies? Once you've given students some of those analogies, you then want to ask them to determine the strengths and the weaknesses of those analogies. So what does it get right in terms of our understanding of whatever we're studying, and where is the weakness? Where are the limitations? Because all models are wrong. Some are useful. Analogies and metaphors are useful models, but they're not necessarily completely right. And so this is a place where you can actually have students challenge them to say, well, it gets this part of it right, but it's a little bit more complex than what this analogy is telling us. Step 3, ask students to determine how each analogy could be improved. What would you do? What would you add to that analogy? And then ask students to test the analogy against a series of what if questions. Well, what if we change this? Or what if we change this? And see what students come up with. And then ask students to debrief. Like, what did they learn from this connection? And this is a really good way to just start getting students to start thinking just outside that box of learning that core content that you've likely been doing for the last couple of weeks. So that's analogies and metaphors. Another one is curveballs and sequels. Love curveballs and sequels. The idea here is that as students are learning things, and maybe you're having them do a presentation, or they're writing a paper, or they are maybe about to do a group project where they might be like creating a poster or a PowerPoint or whatever it might be. One of the things that might be really helpful is that right before they're about to present and they're pretty close to being done, you want to throw a subtle change at them. So step one would be a few days prior, you're going to throw that change to them. And that change could be something like, hey, I know that in the paper that you were writing, I said you need to have a conclusion. I want you to end that now with a cliffhanger or a metaphor. So they're still having a conclusion, but there's a slight adjustment to what they need to have in the conclusion. Or let's imagine if we go back to the study of the body, imagine students are doing small group presentations on identifying, so diagnosing what a patient may have, and then coming up with a treatment and then a potential prognosis for the student, for that patient. And then you change that on them right before they're presenting. You say, I'm going to give you a different patient, or we just found something different within the lab results, and so we need you to address that. As soon as that happens, step two is you want to provide students time to construct what do they know and what do they need to know, and what are some potential next steps so that they can address this curveball, and have teams share those publicly. Like, here's what I know, here's what I need to know, and here are my potential next steps. And then I would share any additional resources that you can give them to help them address that curveball. Because when they get that curveball, there'll be a sudden kind of change, like they'll feel a little bit challenged. And what we want to do is say, look, we're going to provide you with a lot of support so that you can do it. And then once the students are done with that presentation, sometimes it's really helpful to present them with a sequel. So to say, okay, you've solved this problem. I'm going to give you a new problem in a new context, and I want to give you about 15 minutes to work in small groups to see if you can just find what are the similarities and differences between this new problem I've given you and the problem that you just solved. It's really helpful for transfer. And again, they don't have to do a whole new project, but this to me is a really important part for them to be able to see across multiple contexts and not just get focused in on the one situation that you may have given them. So that's curveballs and sequels. Another one is generating and testing hypotheses. So we see this often in science, but this is something I think you could see across different disciplines. So the first thing is provide students with something to observe and ask them to describe what they're observing. So you can see in this example, there's a graph. But you probably noticed that in this graph, there's not a lot of detailed information. It's just showing the bars. Have students share their descriptions with others and explain what might be happening. And I would just give them a quick, easy prompt, like, I think this is what's happening. Next, have students discuss the similarities and differences in their predictions and what they actually observe. So then you're going to actually give them a little bit of additional information. So you can see on the graph on this that there is some data on the x-axis. So how is that similar and different? So you had this hypothesis. Now you've tested this. What do you notice? Similar, different? Did you get it right? Did you get it wrong? What did you get right? What did you get wrong? And then students share their hypothesis, they evaluate their accuracy and determine what they could predict for the next one. And then the students share what they learned from evaluating their predictions. And then they present the results by sharing, I used to think, and now I think. So to me, this is a really, really helpful way to have students be able to generate a hypothesis and then quickly test it and then do it again and then do it again and then step back and say, what did we see in terms of that change? It really puts them into action, and you don't have to take a ton of time around the hypothesis process. I would be doing it kind of quick to help them really take action into generating those hypotheses. And to me, this helps them with complex problem solving. And you can do this again every single day if you wanted to. Just to give you, if you're interested, those graphs that you see on the board, that comes from slowrevealgraphs.com. And if you go on to slowrevealgraphs.com, they've got a lot of really great examples for you if you wanted to use something like that in your classroom. Next, town hall meeting. This is a really great way to engage students in complex problem solving and to be able to see across multiple contexts as well. So a town hall meeting, 4 steps. Step 1, you assign students roles for discussing and debating another group's solution. So there's typically council members. So you can see in this example, there's council members sitting at a table. Then there are those that support a particular proposal, and then there are town employees, and then those that are against the proposal. And students should remain in character throughout the entire meeting. So you assign students these different roles. Then the teacher shares that one group will present their ideas, followed by questions only from the town council. Then this is repeated from the other group. So typically you're going to have someone that's for, and they're going to present, against, they're going to present. And the town council then discusses this for 2 minutes. The teacher then allows public comment in which those for and against share their comments. After all questions, town employees provide additional information to the council members, and the council members vote on the matter. The teacher then debriefs the process in small groups and shares out with the class. So this is a really nice way to really set up what it looks like in a democratic meeting. So if you ever go to a board meeting, you're often going to see something similar to this, whether that's a town council, whether that's a school board meeting, you're going to see something very similar to this particular process. So town hall meeting is a really great one. Love Chalk Talk. Chalk Talk is a great way to have students share out their ideas, to brainstorm, to help solve different types of problems. And I also love this one because for students who need a little bit more time processing and thinking through things without just immediately having people talk, Chalk Talk is the way to go. So let's look at it in terms of its 4 steps. Step 1, present a question for students to reflect upon, and then give students an additional question that they should be prepared to think through with others. Step 2, tell students that they will now answer questions with 2 other people. So you're going to put them into a group and ask students to form groups and then stand near a large piece of paper. So you should have some large paper or whiteboards. And then students should each have a different colored marker. So everyone should have a different colored marker in the group, and then begin drawing visuals, drawing connection lines to other questions and comments. So in that second question, they should now start to draw, put ideas up, but they should not talk during this time. So the teacher just gives them a prompt and says, okay, start writing what you think about that. And so students can connect ideas, put exclamation points, but no speaking. Then students should rotate to other groups' papers and begin adding ideas and questions. And again, students should not talk during this time. So as a teacher, you might rotate clockwise. They go to a different group, or you could let them just kind of meander to other groups. And then once they get to that next paper or board, have them add to it, draw, or put question marks. But we don't want to talk during this time. And then let them go back to their original paper and then discuss any questions, comments, or understandings that emerged during the activity. And then these ideas are shared as a class. So you could do this in a lot of different ways. You could do this with problem identification. You could do this with solution criteria. So what criteria should we use in our solution, or a solution choice? Or you could even do it in like your plan for implementation, getting ready for a presentation. This could also be for your presentation. I think there's a lot of ways that you could use Chalk Talk. Love this one to use with students. World Cafe is another great process to synthesize ideas. I love this as bringing ideas together. So to me, this is a great way to converge ideas, but you could also use it for divergent ways as well. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do this. So the way that World Cafe works is that students are placed in small groups near a blank poster, again, whiteboard on the wall. One student in that group should be the scribe. And then the teacher provides a prompt and an example for students to discuss. And the scribe writes down those responses. It could be in a list, an analogy, a concept map. The first time you do this, it's likely always going to be a list, but then I would encourage students to say, can you do something other than a list when you're having this discussion? With the exception of the scribe, so when you get to step 2, students move to a new poster. And students should not go to a cafe with the same students. So what I would say is don't do a clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. Say disperse, go to a different poster, not with the same students. The scribe stays, and then when the next group comes in, the scribe shares what the prior group discussed and then hands the pen to a new scribe. The step 3 is then the teacher provides a new prompt, and students are tasked with integrating the new prompt with what had been previously discussed. And then step 2 and 3 is repeated 2 more times. So they at least do this 4 times total. The teacher then walks around the class and places one dot on each cafe, and then asks students to determine if the dot means the work is accurate or if something needs to change. And so this is really helpful. So you bring students back to their original poster that they started with, and there's usually a dot. And then they have to figure out that dot that the teacher put on, was that accurate? Is that something that needs to change? And then they have to work with another group to try to convince the other group whether that's correct or needs to change over time. Really helps with stimulating dialogue over time. So in order to do this, a couple things I would suggest is set up some set plays. So do this with a group of teachers or in one classroom, similar to like what we'd see in a lesson study. And then walk through, okay, here's what the teacher action is, the student action, and then this is the reading and writing and talking tasks that the students will do. What City and Elmore call the instructional core. And then walk through what all of those steps would look like and then implement that together before you start to try to scale this. To me, this is an opportunity to get some level of precision around that. And with all of the other videos, here are just a couple of ways that you could start looking at it. So you explain and walk through it. So use that 4 square, kind of go through the whole thing, outline the 4 steps, discuss where you would place it, then demo this, right? Model this, and then pick a time, a date, and a class to implement, and then select those look fors to determine the impact of that work. I would strongly encourage you to have someone to observe so that they can debrief with you. Their job isn't to evaluate you. Their job is to really be able to process it with you and then continue to implement and inspect over a few cycles to really make sure that you're seeing growth, or you're saying like, look, I've done this enough times with students. It's not making the gains that I want, or I'm starting to see that shift over time. With these transfer level activities, many students have not had this exposure before. John Hattie looked at 17,000 classrooms and he did not find one example of teachers teaching transfer. I think that's often because we treat it as an event, like a big project, instead of these small doable routines, like some of the things we looked at here. My suggestion is, or my interpretation of that is that then students are going to be very unfamiliar, as are we, which means it's going to be a slow burn. We got to take some time with this. So with these, I would say give this a go for at least a quarter before you start saying, yeah, I might not do that one, or I'm going to make a major shift in these practices. Anyways, those are a couple of things to consider in teaching for transfer. Thanks, everybody.